So I'm going to recognize myself here for first round of questions. Decisions made at the Department of Defense and other federal agencies should be based on one thing and one thing only: what's in the best interests of the American public. But big defense contractors have a different set of incentives. They are responsible to their shareholders, and that means their job is to make as much as they can in profits. Mr. Wilkerson, you have decades of experience in Republican and Democratic administrations, both in uniform at DOD, ultimately as Special Assistant for the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Colin Powell, and as a civilian in the State Department. So you've seen the relationship between the federal government and private industry up close and personal. Now, there are a lot of different ways that industry seeks to influence decision-making at the Pentagon, and a key one is by use of the revolving door. So, Mr. Wilkerson, let me just ask you, were you lobbied by former colleagues who were hoping to influence your decision-making when you worked either at the Pentagon or the State Department?
I was at both places. I was asked legally, in view of the administrative instructions I had received when I became director and deputy director of the Marine Corps War College at Quantico, Virginia. In other words, they came to me after I retired. Mm-hmm. At State, it was quite the opposite. I had to tell them mid-sentence, as it were, stop, motion my staff assistant to come in, escort this gentleman out, please, because he's getting ready to make an offer of employment to me, and I can't even listen to it. And that was my administrative instructions when I did my financial disclosure form and went through the White House background investigation and everything else. I knew that I could not entertain an offer for civilian employment post my position until I was out of it.
So you're telling me, just to make sure I'm following you as we go through this, so you're saying while you were still working for the government, that there were defense contractors who were pretty clearly willing to step over the line to try to make you an offer of employment while you were still a government employee?
Yes, ma'am.
How about on the other side? Were they lobbying you about contracts, other things?
Not directly. It's a little bit more pernicious than that. For example, when I would sit down at lunch with Turki Al-Faisal, who at that time was head of Saudi intelligence, with David Ignatius from the Washington Post on the other side of me, and listen to the conversation at the table, I knew there was influence being peddled. Was there an exchange of money? I don't know. I myself was offered a couple of $1,000s from a Saudi official in order to do this, that, and the other thing, and I told him simply, I can't take it. If there is a really, truly pernicious relationship with flag officers, and I'm sad to say colonels too, I'm sad to say it seems to predominate in the Air Force. It's everywhere, but in the Air Force it's really bad. It's Saudis going to work for the Saudis, and whatever it is they do for the Saudis. I spent a lot of time in this building lobbying to get the Senate to pass, and then in the House to get the House to pass the legislation under the War Powers Resolution that would get us out of the war in Yemen. Mm-hmm. We got it passed in both houses. Unfortunately, President Trump vetoed it. I encountered people all the time who were being influenced by Saudi money that was exercised, if you will, in order to keep that vote from being successful.
So let me just back it up a little bit. I very much appreciate your firsthand account here. To ask you about, based on your experience in government, I just want to focus on the part about why defense contractors, not just foreign governments, but defense contractors like Boeing or Raytheon, why is it they want to hire former Pentagon employees to work for them as lobbyists? What do they see as the benefit? Why is it better to have someone who, for instance, they could hire people whose profession is lobbying? Someone who's lobbied in another field, say for the last 10 years, but they don't want that. They'll take somebody who's never lobbied before, but who's been employed at the Pentagon. Why is that?
Well, there are a number of reasons, but I think the number one reason is because they know people who are their contemporaries, who are in the building, as it were, or wherever it happens to be, and they also know that that individual usually '06, '07, '08, or up, has contacts elsewhere in the defense contracting business, now really just about 8 biggies, and they know that that person knows how to work those contacts. And if it's a specific program like the F-35, for example, with which I'm somewhat familiar, then you get people who are very familiar with that on the inside, know all about the lies that you've been telling the federal government with regard to the program, and will come out and reinforce those lies, deceit, if you will, from their position with your business. It's a very insidious, pernicious thing.
So I take it that this is really why federal law has long recognized the importance of trying to insulate the work of the federal government from the influence of private industry. We've been driving in this direction for a long time, just not very successfully. You know, federal law requires that government officials, depending on where you are, wait 1 year or 2 years based on their seniority before lobbying their former agency. I think this is called a cooling off period. Ms. Bryan, let me ask you about this. You run an organization called POGO that works as a nonpartisan government watchdog. Is a 2-year cooling off period sufficient to address concerns about conflicts of interest?
It's a step in the right direction, Chairwoman, but it's not enough. It's been clear to us that you really need to, especially when you're talking about political appointees, look to the end of an administration, the length of the time of an administration, which is often 4 or even longer, depending if the person is reelected. And this is something that we have done an analysis of the past presidential ethics orders, all the way back to President Clinton. Each president has had some form of ethics order, often applying as much as a 5-year cooling off period. But we do think a 4-year or at least to the end of an administration when it comes to those appointees is important. And I'd love to include for the record sort of our evaluation of those various considerations and how they could be applied through legislation.
Without objection.
Thank you.
You know, one of the common arguments that some of my colleagues make about cooling off periods is that if we lengthen them, it will make it tougher to recruit talented people to work at DOD. Now, I always want to pause when I hear that argument and say, think about that for a minute. The claim is, if somebody knew that federal law would prevent them from becoming a lobbyist after they left their federal job, that they would choose not to come to work at the DOD in the first place. Ms. Wilkerson, based on your experience, if we told people who were in line for top Pentagon jobs that they would need to wait 4 years instead of 3 years or 2 years before they could become lobbyists after they left that job, do you think this would make it harder for DOD to attract the talent that they need?
I don't. And I go back to Admiral Spruance, Admiral Nimitz, Admiral Halsey, General Eisenhower, and a host of other characters whom we all know from World War II who weren't so motivated. They didn't have that incentive to do what it was they did, which was quite phenomenal, if you think about it.
And is it your experience or your sense that extending our cooling off period would strengthen or weaken our national security?
I don't know what the exact time would be that would be most effective, but I think it is a measure. It is a measure. I would rather see, frankly, I would rather see the military reinstitute what I got at the Naval War College from Admiral Stockdale and a guy by the name of Joe Brennan, which was ethics in military service, and be a subject of a seminar, for example, that had standing room only crowds in it, because that's not something we teach as a country anymore.
Fair point. Fair point. I'm going to do one last question because I'm way over time. I was filling in while everybody was voting here. But my last question is to you, Ms. Bryan. POGO's been around for over 40 years that you've been looking at this issue. You've been investigating these problems for nearly that long. Do you think we need more studies before we take steps to strengthen Pentagon ethics requirements?
My plea is not for us to do any more studying. As you mentioned, the POGO ourselves have been doing this work since the 1980s with analyses. The GAO has at least 40 years of reports, more than 40 years of reports studying this. The inspectors general have as well. We don't really need to be studying this anymore. We really do know the problem here. We just need to fix the problem. If I could add to the point you raised before about those who might not want to come into government if they, or into the Defense Department if they know they can't become lobbyists afterwards, I would argue I don't want them in the Defense Department then, and I'm glad that they're reluctant to go in.
Right. So thank you. You know, I just want to close this by saying I have a bill that would combat giant defense contractors' capture of the Pentagon by making some ethics reforms. We should close influence peddling loopholes so the definitions of lobbying capture all of the work that corporations do to try to tilt the system in their favor. We should extend recusal periods for people who come to DOD from giant Pentagon contractors, and we should require more public reporting on these companies about their hiring of former Department of Defense officials. A good place to start this is by extending those cooling off periods for at least 4 years. And with that, I apologize to my colleagues for going so long and turn this over to Mr.